So I'm Cecily Thompson-Williams. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law for all of 2 weeks. So just kind of getting started here. And I'm really excited to, one, meet everyone and start learning more about the community, but also to be able to introduce today's event. But before I do that, I want to just tell you a little bit about some things that we have coming up at the center. There are some flyers on the table outside that you can pick up. We have 3 events coming up just very shortly that we wanted to let you know about. The first one is Thursday, which I believe is tomorrow, right? Tomorrow evening we have a film series, a third in the series. It's The Redemption of General Butt Naked, a very interesting film. Rave reviews, don't want to miss it, if for the title alone, which you can go and find out why it's called that. That is at the Castle Arts Center tomorrow night at 5:30. We also have Controversial Conversations in Human Rights as part of Immigrant Rights Week. This version, this set of Controversial Conversation will talk about who deserves asylum. And if you're not familiar with the format, it's an opportunity for students to have a conversation with other students about the answers to those questions. So that one's going to be on the 17th from 12 to 1:20 right back here. And then the other one that we wanted to let you know about, because it's coming up very shortly, is 40 Years After Attica, which is going to be on Tuesday the 18th. Again, that one is a lunch from 12 to 1:20 and 6:03. And it's an opportunity to hear from Professor Herman Schwartz, who was one of the first mediators at Attica, to talk about what happened, what went wrong, and what that means for our legal system. So please consider attending these events. To learn more about them, pick up a flyer, or you can visit our website, which is, okay, to make sure I get this right, WCLCenterforHR.org. And you can sign up for our listserv there as well, so you can learn about other upcoming opportunities and events. So today, we are very, very pleased to be bringing you this panel on Constitution, Pandemics, and Politics. We're even more excited because lovely Ms. Ann Jordan is the director of the Center's program on human trafficking and forced labor, and is going to take it back.
Thank you. Well, I am really happy to have Joanna here today because this is someone I've been communicating with by email, and I've been following her work for many years, but I've never actually had a chance to meet her in person. So I think it's going to be a very interesting event for all of you because she is not a lawyer. She works on health issues. And the reason that I and other people who work on the issue of human trafficking and forced labor find ourselves drawn quite often to the work that's been done by people in the health community is because they do really very important work on the ground, and they work with the populations that are affected, whether they are in labor camps or they are in brothels. And so Joanna's work has been quite important to bring to people's attention the ways in which human trafficking efforts, which are usually kept in a single silo of kind of the way that people approach the issue, and people tend to think of human trafficking as being something that occurs in and of itself in a specific way that is not impacted by other or impact on other types of work or other communities. So we're really lucky to have her here. I counted up the countries that she's had work experience in. It's at least 26. Today she's only going to talk about 2 of the countries in which she has done some work, and those are specifically to demonstrate to you the impact that she has found on the ground of how anti-human trafficking work that is not really grounded in reality can have an impact that can be negative to people that are intended to be benefited, or on people for whom there has actually never been taken into consideration in developing such programs. So she will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for giving up your lunch hour. Glad to see that free food is part of the policy here. As Anne mentioned, I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, because I think it's most interesting if we then have a chance to have a bit of a discussion and questions, and I find it's a topic that generates a lot of questions, so we might get at some of the more interesting stuff that way a bit later. But just to give an overview, I'm going to skim over what trafficking is, because I think you're probably better placed as lawyers and law students to look into all the definitions. I am going to talk a bit more about what I think are the conceptual challenges posed by this idea of trafficking, human trafficking. And then the bulk of the presentation will focus on the work that I did in Cambodia among Vietnamese migrant sex workers who are working in Cambodia, and talk a little bit about the implications for health programming and for the human rights on the ground that anti-trafficking measures have had. And then just briefly give some preliminary findings from work that's being conducted among Eastern European migrant sex workers in London, to show some of the parallels, even though we're talking about such different geographical regions and cultures. Anne said that you all know where to go find the definition of trafficking in persons. So I won't dwell on this, except to say that the definition, although vague, does specify that there must be some sort of threat or use of force or coercion to the trafficking experience, and then it must result in some form of exploitation. And then specifically, exploitation relates to either the prostitution of others, which includes sexual exploitation or sexual prostitution, but also forced labor of other forms. And then also just to say that the element of coercion is not relevant for anyone who's under the age of 18. That's considered an automatic definition of trafficking if someone who's under the age of 18. Although there is such a broad set of destination occupations into which people are trafficking, my perception, at least, of what makes it into the media and into policy debates is that there's a real focus on the sex industry. And so much so that when people hear about human trafficking, they tend to immediately think about prostitution and sex work, despite the fact that we really don't have any sense of the relative numbers in any of these industries. And certainly in Europe, more people have come forward and self-identified as having been trafficked in some of the other more agriculture-based or fishing industry-based industries than they have from sex work. And the reason why I just highlight this is it's gotten to the point where there's almost a confusion between migration, sex work, and trafficking. So people assume that trafficked people are sex workers, that migrant sex workers must have been trafficked, and I think that there's been a kind of lack of clarity around these different terms. So the questions that I would suggest you keep in mind as I give some examples from the field is, when you're talking about programming on the ground, is trafficking actually a coherent concept that's adding any sort of useful benefits? And is it really describing anything new conceptually? And then for me, the big questions are, there's an awful lot of anti-trafficking policy that's out there that's supposed to be very broad-based and wide-sweeping and address all human trafficking. And yet I think the experience of people who have ended up sort of smuggled into a country in order to be put to work on large-scale industrialized farms is probably quite different from people who travel with family members or boyfriends in very small numbers and end up in individual brothels that are scattered around somewhere. And I don't really know if the legal and the programmatic measures can be applied to both those situations in the same way. And most worryingly, why are there so few trafficked or migrant people who give input into these discussions and debates? And just as an illustration, it seems to me that specifically if we're looking at trafficking into the sex industry, which is what I have focused on, is we already have debates, discourses, policies, laws that deal with labor exploitation issues. And we already have a set of discussions around migration, and certainly in terms of sex work, there is no shortage of different competing views and polemical debates and legal sort of reform measures and so forth. And for me, I don't see the point of having one more. So here's this, at this intersection is where human trafficking into sex work is supposed to take place and have all these new sort of policies and laws and measures. And for me, it's redundant. You've got these different areas. And I would question the need for yet another sort of set. Particularly since it's so difficult to know what we're even talking about. And I won't go into the debates around numbers, but there are a lot of very heated discussions about how many people in any given situations have or have not been trafficked. There's a lot of very poor research. Basically, it's almost impossible. You're never going to have a verifiable sample size of people who you can, we're talking about illegal activity and very hidden populations. So it's very difficult to really know what we're talking about. And furthermore, identifying exploitation and whether or not exploitation has occurred has its own set of complicated, nuanced difficulties that have to do around what you do consider to be consent and what people can or cannot consent to. What is free choice versus constrained circumstances. Different cultures interpret those kinds of things quite differently. Certainly when you start talking about sexual relationships and sexual activity, to what extent people are making choices versus fulfilling cultural norms and so forth. It's not really very black and white and straightforward. And also, that final point there, which is in smaller print, that people change over time. And so quite often, there's this desire to separate who's been trafficked from who hasn't. But people have very complex trajectories over time, and it might be that a young woman migrated, she sort of knew she was probably going to be selling sex, but then when she arrives in the brothel, she didn't realize that she wouldn't be making all the money, that in fact some of the money would be going to someone else, or her debt would be increasing. So she gets out of that brothel and moves to a different brothel, and there she's much more likely to make her own money and is in control of the circumstances. But then she falls in love, and so she leaves with her boyfriend, but then it turns out her boyfriend is going to take away her passport and control her basically as a pimp or a manager. These things change over time, and some of those scenarios fit the legal definition of trafficking and some don't. And the needs of that person and how they perceive their own situation will also change. And again, I don't think it handles very kinds of sort of straightforward approaches. You must help a trafficking victim in this way, as opposed to sort of appreciating that the circumstances will change over time, and therefore what you should do about it might also change. And then just very finally, in terms of conceptual issues, I think trafficking has a sort of inherent patronizing tone to it quite often. And often there's a real focus on female victims of trafficking. Men are somehow able to migrate across borders and get in and out of difficult situations and make money and send it home, but women are more vulnerable. They're the ones who get duped more easily and coerced. And I worry about some of those, how paternalistic, I think is the term I'm looking for, that ends up sounding. And then there's a lot of assumptions about when is someone vulnerable and when are they not. A lot of assumptions about what sex work is or is not. And then there's issues around access to the formal labor market, which, when restricted, tends to push people into the informal labor market, which I would argue is where the coercion might really occur. So to get into the work I did in Cambodia, this is a while ago now, almost 10 years ago, really. And just to reiterate that I come completely from a public health background. I worked for the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which is the School of International Public Health, and my focus has been sexual health throughout. So I've worked primarily on family planning, HIV prevention, sexually transmitted infection prevention, and increasingly on antiretroviral provision for HIV. So that's how I got into this whole area of work. And I happened to be living in Southeast Asia in the late 90s. I was at the time working for a research institution called the Population Council, which does work on reproductive health. And at the time, basically, Cambodia had just opened up. It was sort of following the long-standing civil war and the conflict there and occupation by Vietnam, and following the UN peacekeeping transitional authority. Basically, they had their first democratic elections in the mid-90s, and aid money was flooding in, and aid agencies were flooding in, and people were just starting to work out what was going on. And from a public health perspective, what was going on was the largest HIV epidemic outside of Africa. So there was a lot of HIV programming and a lot of money going in, working with high-risk groups in particular, and sex workers there wasn't so much injecting drug use at the time in Cambodia, so there was quite a lot of sex work and a very visible sex industry. So that's where the focus was going. And as a result of that focus, that started to attract attention more internationally from a human rights and anti-trafficking perspective. Cambodia was a sort of perfect storm for anti-trafficking measures in the sense that there was a lot of donor funding, and there was a very weak government that was completely dependent on multilateral and bilateral money for setting up basically all of its governmental systems. So it was kind of an experimental site where anybody with that donor money could decide what made it onto the agenda and fund it accordingly. So to go away from that sort of broad-based policy perspective, let's take a look at SPIPAC. SPIPAC was just one brothel district of many. It had approximately 300 sex workers working out of 22 brothels when we started. It was called Kilometer 11 because that's how far it is from Phnom Penh, which is the capital city. And at the time, there wasn't a paved road. So it took about 45 minutes to get to SPIPAC over very bumpy dirt roads by motorbike or Land Rover or whatever. And all of the sex workers in SPIPAC were Vietnamese. In fact, all of SPIPAC was Vietnamese. It was actually traditionally a Vietnamese migrant fishing village. It's along the Tonle Sap River. And there were very close relationships between individual brothels in SPIPAC and villages back in Vietnam. And women would come over for roughly between 6 months and 2 years, brought by relatives usually, and put into a system of debt bondage, which meant that an initial upfront fee was paid to their family, and this was about $300 or $350. And the sex worker would then, she'd stay in the brothel and she'd work off her debt at a rate of 50-50, meaning that for every client she had, half of the fee that he paid would be pure profit for her, and half of it would pay off the debt to the brothel owner or brothel manager. And unlike in other settings you may have heard about where people never get out of debt and there's a lot of fake accounting that goes on and things keep getting added, this was not the case in SPIPAC. They were quite good, with few exceptions. It was quite transparent system, and after 6 months to 2 years, depending on how many clients the sex worker had, she would pay off her debt. And mostly she'd go home. Some chose not to go home. Some chose to take out another debt to send home another lump sum and continue to work it off. And some would rent a room in a brothel and work independently for themselves. It varied. I mentioned before that there was high prevalence of HIV, particularly among sex workers. Nationally at the time, it was about 40%. This has gone way down since the late 90s. And also, we don't have specific rates for the SPIPAC district. And Médecins Sans Frontières was operating a clinic, and this is the clinic with which I was collaborating to build a sort of harm reduction HIV prevention program, which is how I found myself on a regular basis in SPIPAC. To look at the living and working conditions there, basically there was a lot of competition between sex workers individually, but particularly between brothels. They were competing with each other, and as a result, there were a lot of restrictions on the women in terms of being able to move around. They were pretty much expected to stay put in the brothel, work in the afternoons and evenings, and there was always a little bit of a concern that they might defect to another brothel or try to run away before they paid off their debt. And there was also fear that if they wandered too far that they might get arrested, because sex work was basically, it was de facto criminalized. There weren't really that many laws on the issue at the time, but the police, who were very unregulated and were basically left to their own devices and were armed, set up their own sort of protection rackets with a lot of this with sex work or other sort of informal labor. So these women were not only illegal immigrants from Vietnam, but they were in a basically illegal occupation. And so they were very worried that police had a tendency to round up sex workers and arrest them, and then bribes would have to be paid by the brothel owner in order to release them back. Clients, there was a big mix of clients, but basically business was slowing down. And there was a lot of complaints when I was there that there was pressure to take on more clients or to take on clients for lower amounts of money. And there was greater competition. And this is for two reasons. The first is that the United Nations peacekeeping forces had all gone home, and they had been a huge client base for sex workers. And the other reason is that as Cambodia became more stable and peaceful, more and more brothel districts closer to the center of town were opening up, and those were more attractive. So just to give you an idea, here's another photo of some young women who worked at SPIPAC. That we were not just a clinical program, we were very much a kind of community development project. There was a lot of growing evidence at the time that to counteract HIV, it wasn't enough to tell people about condoms and hand out condoms. It was a lot more about empowering people to change the circumstances of their vulnerability. So a lot of what we did was bring sex workers together to try to build up their relationships and their solidarity, and to try to increase almost a communal pressure on clients to refuse to have sex without a condom, and to make SPIPAC a sort of safe sex zone, if you will, and to negotiate, for sex workers to negotiate and support each other when dealing with their brothel managers. It was sort of a social mobilization or community development approach. But within that, there started to be more and more interest in trafficking and in Cambodia as a destination country for trafficking. So because we already had such a good relationship with sex workers there, migrant sex workers, we conducted a sort of mini study within the wider research around HIV to look specifically at how sex workers had come from Vietnam and their entry into sex work. And this was through a combination of in-depth interviews and various participatory workshops conducted in Vietnamese by staff who the sex workers already knew and trusted. Although, of course, there's a whole host of methodological problems in addressing this kind of sensitive area and sensitive topics, which you're welcome to ask me about later. But basically, our findings were that there was a long tradition of migration from Vietnam into Cambodia when things were tough back home. And these sex workers came from villages in southern Vietnam, which had basically been in the part of Vietnam that had lost the Vietnam War and was being punished even 20 years later by the Vietnamese government, and didn't have the same agricultural subsidies, development programs, livelihood opportunities, and so there was a lot of rural poverty. And one way to alleviate this poverty at household level was to send daughters to Cambodia for a few years who would bring back money. And this tended to be triggered either just by the desire for more consumer goods. So, I want to disabuse you immediately of this idea that these are families, on the verge of starvation who have to send their daughters over because otherwise they're not going to have food on the table. This was about satellite dishes and 4x4s and other kind of things that were seen as being contributing to the social standing of the family. And the young women were incredibly proud of this. They were very proud of the contribution that they were making to the family wealth. But also, it was often, if there was a sudden change in family circumstances, that was also often the trigger for sending a daughter over to Cambodia. So if a family, if a household earner had died or fallen ill, or suddenly there were hospital expenses that the family had to contend with, or something like that. And then in some cases, it was young women who were, didn't really like living on a rice farm back home and were looking for adventure and new opportunities. Of the 100 women that were included in this particular study, we found 6 women who would have fit the UN definition of trafficking in the sense of reporting that they had been deceived or coerced into the migration process of the sex work itself. Although that's not to say that there wasn't pressure from family members to do so. So there was sort of this kind of gradient of different pressure or expectation, but only 6 clear-cut cases of deception, coercion, being forced, so forth. And the women reported that they generally knew what circumstances they'd be working under, which is not true for sex workers in all situations, but there had been so many waves of women coming and going from SPIPAC that there was pretty good information on the ground back in Vietnam as to what you would be getting yourself into if you went to SPIPAC. So women would be aware that they'd be working as sex workers in brothels under the system of debt bondage. What they didn't know was how much harder it was going to be to make money. And basically, news hadn't caught up yet that financial circumstances in SPIPAC had gone down. And so a lot of women were frustrated that they were having to work longer than they expected, and they weren't making nearly as much money as they hoped. And then just to talk about perceptions of sex work, this wasn't so much of a culture where there was such shame attached to sex work that women would never be able to go back well, go back at all, as is the case in some places, or go back and mention what it was that they had been involved in. There was a sort of, I don't think people boasted about it, but there was, an understanding of when women came back from Cambodia with a lot of money, what it was that they'd been doing. And it was it was seen as acceptable. It was also seen as better than a lot of other options on offer, and not particularly hard work compared to working in the rice fields. I met quite a few women who had paid off their debt, gone back to Vietnam, and came back very quickly and said, oh, this is so boring back home, and all they want me to do is work in the farm and get married. So the concerns that used to come up, if I was to talk about what were the main concerns of sex workers in Spy Pack, it was about money. It was about not having enough clients. And it was sometimes about not being able to negotiate the work conditions that they would have liked, particularly negotiating with brothel owners in terms of having time off, and there was some violent relationships with brothel owners. But the biggest fear by far, the biggest fear, was the harassment and the raids that came from the police, and the extortion, and the concern, the fear that they would be arrested and held in prison and possibly abused by the police before the bribe was paid. And while I was there, there were so many police raids, and they were terrifying experiences. The women would all dash into their brothels, the police would come in with the sirens wailing, all the brothel owners would shut, they had these big metal grills on the front of the brothels, they'd all close them down there and lock them in there. And they'd be hiding, and they'd be being dragged into police cars, and it was really a scary situation. And it often closed down the brothel district for days. Sex workers would just stay behind the grids, and they certainly wouldn't make it to the clinic or to the health program that we were running. And clients would just let in. If the clients were trusted, then they'd quickly open the door and let the client in and close it again. So just to give you the idea of the responses that to the situation of migrant sex work in Cambodia at the time, I would position myself very much in the health NGO sector. So I was very much trying to increase harm reduction programs, and so this has to do with meeting the immediate needs, which was, from my sector, about outreach, testing and counseling, but also family planning, addressing other primary health care type issues. But we also did quite a lot, like I mentioned before, about building up sex worker solidarity, community, and a lot of that was then to try to advocate to improve their work conditions, particularly advocating with the brothel managers, and increasingly in Cambodia, various sex worker unions and sex worker organizations were being brought together. The anti-trafficking movement started a little bit later, I would say, sort of the late 90s, and the focus there tended to be on rescue and rehabilitation. But unfortunately, they were unable to conduct any rescue missions on their own, just being NGOs. They had to hire the police in order to do the rescue raids. And the rescue raids, as a result, ended up looking no different from just a regular police raid, which was for profit, police profit. You couldn't tell. You couldn't tell where, when the sex workers were all rounded up, whether they were going back to the police station to wait for a bribe to be paid, or whether they were taken to a rehabilitation center. You wouldn't have been able to guess. And then the rehabilitation center was very much about trying to reunite sex workers with their family members. But a lot of these programs didn't have much in the way of follow-up monitoring. And we would see lots of sex workers who ended up in some rehabilitation center, and what would happen is the rehabilitation center would contact the family, the girl's family back in Vietnam, and say, just to let you know, we've rescued your daughter. And the family would say, oh, thank you so much, that's great, we're going to come get her. And they'd come get her, and they'd sign all the release forms, and then they'd bring her back to Spy Buck, where she had to make up the money that they just spent traveling all the way to Vietnam in order to do so. From the government side, the government was responding to everybody's different kind of policy pressures. So from the HIV perspective, they wanted to recreate Thailand's very successful 100% condom use model. So that was implemented. If you're unfamiliar with this, this is where Thailand made it mandatory that all brothels brothels were basically decriminalized, but it was mandatory to use condoms within them. And whole brothels could be shut down if there was any evidence that condoms weren't being used. So it wasn't targeting sex workers, it was targeting whole sort of establishments and management of sex workers. So Cambodia tried to initiate this, but unfortunately didn't quite have the same public health system infrastructure in order to make it successful. But at the same time, they also wanted to tackle trafficking, so they signed up in 2001 to the UN protocol. And increasingly, the U.S. was putting pressure on, through its mechanism of where the U.S. has this trafficking report that comes out every year, and countries are classified as tier 1, tier 2, and so forth. And if you're not on a very high tier, I can't remember which way the tiers go, but I mean, basically, unless you behave yourself, your funding drops. And because Cambodia pretty much got the bulk of its entire budgetary support from the U.S., it was very keen to show that it was doing something to tackle trafficking. But of course, the police were the ones who were going to implement any kind of anti-trafficking policy, and the police had their own agendas and were very heavily involved in the provision of sex work, and I've already described how disruptive the raids were. So, from my perspective, sitting in SPIPOC and trying to run a health program, the anti-trafficking approaches did nothing except increase human rights violations. We had more police presence, more raids, more debt added to the sex workers, the payments that they had to make because they had to be then taken out of rehabilitation centers and so forth. Nobody asked sex workers before they arrested them whether they had been trafficked or not trafficked, or whether they wanted to be rehabilitated. And this was contributing to, in my view, a very unsafe environment where sex workers were in even greater competition with each other. And therefore, as this quote demonstrates, more likely to not enforce condom use because they're so desperate to have any client. Yeah, I'm going to wrap up now. I won't go into that. So, to me, I didn't see much in the way of a positive effect. And also, there started to be growing distrust between sex workers and the various NGOs and service providers, because nobody was really sure who was a raid and rescue NGO and where the information had been coming from, and were we as in the clinic passing on information to the police. And there was a sort of a reduction in, I would say, trust between service providers, and therefore a greater desire to hide, a greater desire to have no contact with anyone and to go underground and to hide the brothels and so forth. I won't go into this little story. The program basically eventually lost its USAID funding because after the election of President George Bush, the funding, we had been funded by the U.S., and U.S. funding came under very careful scrutiny, and under the Bush administration there was a real concern that any sort of funding for sex worker health projects was basically condoning sexual slavery. And a professor at a university in Rhode Island wrote some very convincing pieces about how we were part of aiding and abetting the slave trade, as you can see there. So we lost a lot of money, and well, it's a long story, but we had to go defend ourselves in front of the House Committee on International Relations, and the project, which was sort of limping to a close anyway for a range of reasons, sort of got closed down right at the end. Never wrote a final report, and so forth. So I think I'm probably just going to end on just two more slides. The first is that I think there's a lot of dangers in these anti-trafficking measures, that they're extremely well-meaning, and they might on paper sound very sensible, but the way they get played out in local realities don't really fit the situation. And they tend to be very moralistic and emotive. And they're not really considering the wider frameworks about migrants' rights, migrant empowerment, what migrants do or don't want when they consider themselves to be exploited or not exploited. And I won't go into the London example, except to say that the Olympics are coming to London next year, and this is coinciding with the desire to clean up London, like tends to happen in cities before any big sporting event, at the same time that politically we're having a growth in anti-immigration sentiment. And so suddenly, I mean, it's like watching the whole thing be repeated in a completely different context. Suddenly, it's all over the news that there's, gazillions of migrants being trafficked into the sex industry, and that there's going to be even more to fulfill the demands of the Olympic, all the tourists who come for the Olympics who need sex workers when they're not watching sports. And just just to say that we did a survey of East European sex workers in London, very few of whom matched the definition of trafficking. In fact, 7% of the ones we interviewed, but then again, so did 3% of the UK-born ones. So it's not just an issue of migration or not migration. But basically, we're seeing the same thing, that women who have less access to services have higher rates of sexually transmitted infections. Those who are migrants also have less access to the health services. Women who have had experience with the police also seem to be at greater risk of violence, and I suspect that's because they end up working in places that are more hidden, less regularized, have no contact with the harm reduction services that do exist. It's like, yet again, we're looking at a situation where the situation is not being understood, and the policies that are being put into place are limiting people's accesses to the few services that they might actually have, rather than helping them. So that's pretty much it. And I was going to conclude with my empowered sex worker slide with the various slogans that the sex worker rights movement uses. But I think I'll leave it on this one in case you have any questions about it. Answer any questions related to trafficking and health anyway. Sorry to speed through. Not enough time for questions, but
Yes.
do you want to moderate questions? Do you want me to do that? Or?
You go ahead and do it. Sure.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the coordination, the implementation on the ground wasn't coinciding with the actual reality on the ground. As you see that continuing in Cambodia now, because there are thousands of NGOs, all with different agendas, we don't necessarily talk to one another. So do you have any recommendations on how intervention groups can improve their communication so that they're both helping the same constituents better?
Yeah, that's tricky, and that's an ongoing problem across sectors. So we had the same, even just with HIV, there were so many different programs that were on HIV prevention and didn't talk to each other and so forth. That tends to be getting better with these larger scale funding mechanisms. So certainly in health, when you have like the global fund on HIV and tuberculosis and malaria and PEPFAR and some of these really large scale funding mechanisms that insist on country coordinating processes to be put in place and forces people to get around the same table and parcel it out. In health, that's making a very, very big difference and works in varying degrees. I don't work in Cambodia anymore. My understanding is that it remains fairly fragmented. Now, in terms of what's going on with the trafficking measures, I don't know. My guess is that there isn't that same kind of pressure to have country coordinating mechanisms, and there probably ought to be. That would be a good middle step. But ultimately, the country needs to have control over its own development, and certainly Cambodia is nowhere close. Cambodia is still completely dominated by external funding, and that sets the agenda, and I can't see how that will change. I guess, yeah, please.
No, I just want to add something that the problem, because I worked in Cambodia also, and it's in other countries also, is that she was saying, the outside donors basically control the activities. In many countries, the only funding for any of this work on anti-trafficking and also for HIV/AIDS, except now India, I guess. But anyway, is outside, and so everyone is competing with everybody else. There's no incentive to share. There's no incentive to work together, because everyone is competing with the same donors for the same funding. And so I just don't see coordination very often in countries where there is a real scramble for funding. And I don't really see a way to improve the situation. For example, I'm doing work in Nepal now. There's 3 networks there in Nepal, but the networks themselves don't coordinate, and even inside the networks, they don't have strong collaborations.
What is the situation with kids, like underage sex workers over there?
Well, that changes over time as well, and it's always a bit difficult to measure. Underage is a slightly tricky, so under 18, the SWIPOC girls were mostly under 18. But, well, not mostly, but quite a few were actually mostly 18 or 19. But 2018, but there's been a lot of pressure to try to change that. So, and in the factories and so forth as well, because there's a lot of factory work that goes on. So formally, it's gotten better. But then I suspect that there was a period of time when there was an awful lot of very, very young children being made available in Phnom Penh and in Cambodia, and that was right after. So when there was a crackdown on sex work in brothels, some of the people who were managing brothels decided it was more money in children and they were easier to kind of move around. And so then there was a sudden upsurge in sort of child sex tourism in Cambodia, but that also has since then that was the next sort of wave of focus that's, I think, been cracked down on a bit, but I don't know. But they're, young kids.
So there's a huge amount of interest among our students and among NGO activists in the field of human trafficking. And your point about a lot of things getting thrown into the definition of human trafficking that isn't necessarily, I think, is well taken. But your message, and I know the position of our program on human trafficking, which aligns very much with what you're talking about, is one that seems to be doesn't get a lot of attention. At least it's one that gets attention within a certain group of people who are talking about it, but I know that for the wide interest in human trafficking that a lot of students, at least, are involved in, they don't necessarily talk about the intricacies of this or why these policies might actually promote violations instead of prevent violations. Why do you think that is, and why is the funding community resistant to, it's called the softball question, why is the funding community resistant to taking the approach that you are presenting?
It doesn't play as well. That's my own, because I've thought about it and I've talked to so many people, and it never is good to say, well, but actually it's really complicated, because then people get so bogged down in it. It's so emotive and it's so easy. You just have to find the Natasha who was thrown into the back of a truck in Ukraine, and nobody says, well, wait a minute, why do we never find so many in England? Why have we just spent this much money showing that our police can do something useful, and yet after however many years they found like 7 people who were victims of trafficking and messed up an awful lot of other people's lives in the meantime. It's so easy. We're talking about it's almost like puppies. It's vulnerable people who are going to be saved. It's so easy. That's the only thing I can think of.
But then why isn't there the same approach to child soldiers? Right? I mean, if you look for the empathy, right? And the terrible story, Natasha being thrown in the back of the truck definitely is a horrible, terrible story, and it does happen.
Yeah, sure.
It does happen, and it's a terrible thing. But there's not the same kind of empathetic emphasis on child soldiers. Is it a prostitution thing?
A little bit.
Is it political, ideological? We have to rehabilitate everybody.
Well, the prostitution thing I think is a big part of it, because you rarely get the story of the equivalent person who made it from China, and then we had that, at least in the UK, we had this disaster where I can't remember how many people drowned. They were picking shellfish off the beach, and it's known for these incredible riptides, and a whole group of people, all of whom it turned out were illegal and probably trafficked. It sounded pretty sort of slave-like conditions. And we worried about it for about 5 minutes while it was in the news, but you don't hear that same narrative of someone who was forced to farm fish. And I think there is something. I think it's a lot easier for people to say, well, wait a minute, we need agriculture, and agriculture is a good thing. That's labor exploitation. Whereas there's something about sex work that, because for the most part, it's not seen as a labor issue. It's seen as an exploitation issue almost by definition. And we haven't won that discussion yet. We haven't gotten over that yet. There's still big debates about, is prostitution by definition exploitation of women? And so then the trafficking, which is so clearly going to be a bad thing, and it feeds into people's view of a bad thing even worse, I think. I don't know.
I remember seeing in Cambodia a lot of publicity that said if you're arrested here for it was mainly for foreigners, if you're for child abuse or for the news will make it to your country. I remember that's pretty much everywhere, or it was pretty out there. Do you think that's it's working, that kind of method?
I don't know, because that wasn't around when I was there. That's all new. And then there were some high-profile cases of foreigners who were convicted of child abuse, and including a former rock star who was then repatriated to the UK, tried in the UK, I think, as well. And so I'm guessing that some of those campaigns are on the back of those kinds of stories. I don't know to what extent they're working. However, I would say most of the clients of both child and adult sex workers are not foreign, so you're targeting a small proportion there. They're just the high-profile cases.
I have a question. Under U.S. law, again under Bush, there was a provision put in the bill for PEPFAR, the president's whatever. Anyway, it's the AIDS fund, right? And there was a provision put in there saying that organizations could not use any of the funds they received to promote or support prostitution and trafficking. So that went to court, and it's not being enforced against U.S.-based NGOs right now, but any U.S. organizations that get funding from PEPFAR, or they get the funding directly if they're outside the United States, they're not U.S.-based NGOs, they do have to make a statement that they do not support, promote, or advocate for the legalization or practice of prostitution, which has essentially been interpreted to mean and has put fear into organizations that if you work with sex workers, or if you work like you were talking about, working with empowering sex workers and helping them build networks so that they themselves can make demands to improve their lives, that if you do that kind of work, then you can't get this funding. And I know you've looked at this. Could you speak a little bit about this and what the impact has been on the ground of this U.S. law? And also, there's a similar provision in the 2005 Trafficking Victims Reauthorization Act. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar.
So a precursor to that formal policy is what got us, basically, which was that USAID, which funded the bulk of health interventions throughout Southeast Asia, overnight flipped its policy on working with sex workers. So they went from actively promoting a community development approach for sex workers to this wording where it was okay to give health, actual health services and provision of condoms and so forth, but you couldn't in any way offer support for decriminalization, legalization, or promotion of prostitution and trafficking. And it was interpreted on the ground incredibly cautiously. So I felt that organizations self-censored themselves. They didn't wait to kind of argue why what they were doing still was within the remit of the U.S. policy. They just dropped their programs for sex workers because they thought it was going to be too sensitive and they needed the funding. And the most ridiculous thing I saw was that in SPIPAC, as this relates to your question, as things were changing and that financially it was not making sense to keep brothels open, there did seem to be an influx of small children being made available to sex tourists, particularly foreign sex tourists. And the drop-in center that was working with the sex workers started to let the kids play in the drop-in center in the day and play with coloring books, and were trying to get information out about what was going on and trying to do like a needs assessment, figure out what was happening, but also give the kids a safe place off the street in the day. And they were told by the kind of umbrella organization that was funding the drop-in center not to let the kids in because it was going to look like U.S. money was going toward condoning child prostitution. And so the result was kicking these kids out onto the street where they were going to sell sex or be vulnerable to abuse, which cannot be what the law intended, but the way that it was interpreted on the ground to avoid getting into trouble. And there certainly have been reports coming out of other countries of that happening at the time.
Well, I just have to say that maybe regarding children, that wasn't the intention, but in a conversation with one of the people on the right who's promoting this, I asked him, what is it then that you want healthcare workers to do, say, for example, in India, if that you want them not to go into brothels anymore and provide healthcare? And because he wanted everyone who had contact with who received U.S. government money, if they had contact with brothels, that they were immediately supposed to go to the U.S. Embassy and report where the brothels were located, as though the Indian government doesn't know, right? And I said, okay, so let's say the magic conditions exist, and all of a sudden they've closed down all these brothels. Where's your economic plan? Where's your program to help provide these women who are almost all illiterate with some sort of education and support? And his response to me was, that's not my problem, that's an economic issue. And I said, do I understand you correctly in saying that you would be perfectly happy to throw these women and children out on the street just because they're sex workers and you don't like what they do? And he said, yes. So you see, when you start talking to the people who are behind the policies that are not informed by this kind of rich knowledge on the ground, you can basically say anything because nobody ever asks and interrogates to find out what are really the consequences of these policies. They're developed in a vacuum. And that's why, I like the work that healthcare workers do often, because it's unlike the people who work, say, in the human trafficking and forced labor field, it is completely grounded and evidence-based. So you can come up with policies and practices that are well informed. People may not always like what they hear because they would like to see the world be a particular way, but the reality can come back and tell you, it is my life and it is my world, and this is how I want to organize it.
You mentioned that Cambodia wasn't able to adopt the 100% condom usage. So did you encounter what happened to the women in the brothels if they became pregnant?
Okay, well, so just to clarify, that was in the early days of the 100% condom process. Actually, it's done pretty well in the long term. That, combined with other behavior change programs, condom use and HIV went down, including among sex workers. So that situation has changed. But pregnancy, they used, the sex workers I worked with, there was a lot of local abortion sort of practitioners. But also they convinced some of their clients to use condoms, and then some of them used various other methods of contraception.
You mentioned earlier that you did a study and 6 of 100 women, I believe, were found to fit the UN definition of trafficking. How exactly did you make that determination?
Yeah, no, so that makes it sound like it was a survey or something, which it wasn't. No, this was of the study I presented, the little kind of nested study that we did on migration. There were 100, it actually is a chance that it came out to such a nice, neat number. We did a bunch of participatory group discussions to discuss the issues with sex workers, and then we also did individual interviews with women who were reporting in those discussions sort of experiences we thought might shed light on the whole kind of movement from Vietnam to Cambodia entry into sex work. It happens that turned out to be 100 women, but it wasn't. And of those, we thought 6. And we feel that that's fairly reflective just from our familiarity. But it's not a scientifically robust statistic for a start. Second of all, we of course would have had the least access to any women who were in serious trouble. So any women who felt so coerced in those brothels that they would really have wanted to get out of that situation will probably not have been allowed to come to our drop-in center and participate in the various activities that were being organized. So the bias is going to be on the side of meeting women who were not trafficked. We'll go back behind her.
Hi. When you mentioned in Cambodia they were coming from southern Vietnam, the families were bringing their daughters there, so to speak. Let's say they're young and don't have a fairly good education. And they receive $250, let's say, for sending their child there. Is there some other alternative where they can get, a quick lump sum besides sending their child as they live like in a rice field or something?
They could sell something if they had an asset. I don't know enough about, I've not been to that region, and don't know what other opportunities they did or didn't have. I'd have thought, I honestly don't know.
Because I feel like they're infiltrating like them, because they're, bringing their children there and saying, like, is there an alternative so they don't feed into the sex market or something? Or?
At the time in Cambodia, at least, there were factories. That was the other big industry that young women entered. There were garment factories in fairly large scale, garment factories. And there was stiff competition to get into those jobs, but illegal Vietnamese migrant wouldn't have gotten those jobs. They would have gone to young Cambodian women. Whether in Vietnam there was any sort of equivalent, I honestly don't know.
I'm not sure if you were still around when the ARTIP was formed. Have you heard about it?
When?
ARTIP, it's the Asian
Yes.
Regional Trafficking Persons Project.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's a
please
regional
stop.
initiative which is funded by the Australian aid because the USA doesn't provide support. I think it started in 2004. And the project is an attempt to create, to have baseline studies with the ASEAN region and to create rules on regional jurisdiction, best practices of countries, and to create anti-trafficking codes. But Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore have not joined. But my question, but the composition of the delegates per country would be composed of lawyers, justice departments, police enforcement officers, and social workers. And I listen to it now and I hear your inputs that it suddenly occurred to me that there are no health workers or people in the public health who are represented. There's none in any of these countries.
Yeah, well,
that's the apparent absence of your
Of health and so well, I don't know about Cambodia. A PhD student of mine just did a PhD on that, looking at Europe, looking at why has all the European legislature and human rights directives and whatever it is that the EU does, why has none of that included input from health workers? In Cambodia, at the time at least, we were kind of silenced because we weren't the only ones. At the time that USAID initiated its, we won't fund anything that promotes, there was actually a bit of a mini uproar at the time about the damage that would do to access through HIV programs. And then subsequently, Human Rights Watch did a report, this is much more recently, when Cambodia actively started enforcing this anti-trafficking law, where they were really throwing sex workers in the back of trucks and taking them off to detention centers, and there were accusations of assault and rape in these detention centers and stuff. And so there have been reports out there, and that drew on the experience of health services at least somewhat, because I know I've talked to some people who still work there and health, who talked about how they lost the antiretroviral, because by then there was antiretroviral therapy available. Antiretroviral therapy programs lost contact to their patients and so forth. So that has come out a little bit. But people didn't want to know about it because it was complicating the issue.
Can I also just say that's the silo problem? Trafficking is seen as an object in and of itself that has to be dealt with. I always maintain there's no such thing as trafficking. What we have is forced labor. We have bad migration. We have bad laws on labor protections. We have discrimination against women. We have all of these things. And trafficking is not really anything new, but once you put a label on it, then everybody wants to become experts, and there's all this money out there, and like you're saying, it's really focused on law enforcement. Because the other thing I didn't hear from what you said is on these committees are any representatives of migrants. I mean, what are you talking about if you're not talking about migrants, even if it's migrant people from a rural community to urban, or from one country to another. So the kinds of policies that you're going to get out of something like that are pretty well predictable. We've seen them all over the world when they don't work. People are not getting arrested, they're not getting prosecuted. Law enforcement is a total failure. Laws that we have in all these countries are a total failure. The fact that somebody in the healthcare sector has access, when you're talking about sex work anyway, to sex workers, they have much more of a capacity actually to build anti-trafficking, anti-child prostitution programs by working with sex workers and helping them collectivize to address these issues themselves than people from the outside who are working on something called trafficking. And we've seen this in countries. We had a panel here several years ago where we had sex worker organizations come, and they're collectives of sex workers, and they were all started by people working on healthcare.
Anything else? Well, thanks very much.